What breaks a species? I have watched 340 species walk into that dome, and I can tell within the first 10 seconds which ones are going to beg. My name is Kaylee's Round. I have administered the Death World adaptation trial for 11 cycles, and in that time I have learned to read a species' entire future in the way its body responds to the crack of the dome opening. I have watched proud Osvane warriors, creatures bred for 6 centuries of continuous warfare, drop to their knees and weep like hatchlings the moment the gravity generators spike to 4 times their homeworld's pull. I have watched armored, venomous, echo-sensing predators turn soldiers lose control of their higher reasoning within minutes of true darkness. The trial isn't meant to be survived comfortably. It's meant to break something open so the Alliance can see what's actually inside a species before we hand it a weapon and a command chain. Today the trial was for 5 new recruits from the newest member of the Concord Alliance, humanity. I hadn't expected much. Their physiological files sat open on my display, and honestly, reading them felt a little like reading a joke. No claws. No venom glands. No exoskeleton, just skin so thin a light scrape drew blood. Eyesight that failed after dusk. Hearing that missed half the frequency range every ambush predator in the quadrant used to signal a strike. By every metric my instruments could measure, humans were among the most physically fragile sapient species the Alliance had ever accepted into its ranks. And yet 3 cycles ago, a single unarmed human diplomat had talked down an entire Scarrow-raiding fleet without anyone firing a shot. 2 cycles before that, a lone human engineer had stayed behind on a failing research station to reroute a collapsing reactor core while every other species evacuated. The Council didn't know what to make of that combination: fragile bodies, unpredictable behavior. Nervous commanders don't like unpredictable variables. Nervous commanders send them to me. So I stood in the observation tower, watching 5 humans step out onto the churned red soil of a simulated death world for the first time, with absolutely no idea that I was about to watch every assumption I'd built my career on come apart in real time. The first 10 minutes. The dome's air was thin and sour, laced with sulfur compounds that would blister any unprotected set of lungs. Gravity sat at 1.5 times standard, enough to make every stride feel like wading through wet sand. Bruise-colored storm clouds rolled overhead, and somewhere past the ridgeline, a Karkath Pack's low call rolled across the rock like a warning. The first human out of the transport pod was a woman named Nadia Osei. She staggered slightly as the gravity hit her, caught her footing, and looked around with wide, bright eyes. I switched on my recorder. Here it comes, I thought. The fear. The pleading for extraction. It always arrived within the first 10 minutes. Nadia took a breath of the acrid air, coughed once, and grinned. "Oh, this is fantastic," she said, her voice carrying clean through the dome's audio pickups. "Feels like altitude training back home. Somebody just added rotten eggs to it." Behind her, a tall man named Tomas Rake dropped into a crouch, running a gloved finger through the mineral-streaked dirt. "Careful," Nadia warned. "Ground's soft near the ridge." Seeing that, Tomas turned the soil over. "This is weathered basalt. Fast weathering means recent volcanic activity, somewhere close." A third recruit, a woman with close-cropped hair named Ingrid Solberg, tipped her head back and studied the storm clouds with an expression I would have called, on any other species, wonder. "Listen to that thunder," she said. "It's got a rhythm. Almost a drumbeat." I frowned at my display. This wasn't fear. It wasn't even the grim, controlled discipline some hardened species managed before the trial turned genuinely dangerous. This looked disturbingly like enthusiasm. The fourth recruit, a broad-shouldered man named Dante Okafor, swung a survival pack onto his shoulders and cracked his knuckles. "All right," he said. "Let's see what this planet's got." The fifth, a smaller woman named Marin Kilbride, was already crouched at a jagged outcrop, running her fingers along a vein of pale crystal threaded through the stone. "This could filter water," she murmured, mostly to herself. If there's water here at all. I pulled up their vitals, expecting the telltale spikes of a fear response hiding under composed exteriors. Elevated heart rate, yes. Elevated adrenaline, yes. But when I checked the secondary markers, the ones that measure dread, I found something that made me recheck the instruments twice. The markers for enjoyment were climbing right alongside the markers for danger. I told myself it was a sensor fault. Species did not enjoy the Death World trial. It wasn't built to be enjoyed. It was built to strip away safety and comfort until only raw instinct remained, so we could measure what a species actually was underneath its civilization. The first real test arrived within the hour, when a Karkath pack crested the ridge at a dead run, 3 of them, 6-legged, armor-hided, claws tearing furrows in the rock. I'd reviewed their profile, pack hunters that had ended entire scouting expeditions from species far better armed than these 5. I expected scattering. Freezing. A doomed sprint for the extraction beacon. Instead, Dante's voice rang out, calm and sharp as a blade. Contact, 3 o'clock. Ingrid, high ground. Tomas, on me. Nadia, Marin, fall back to the outcrop, watch our flank. They moved like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. Ingrid scrambled onto a rock shelf for a clear line of sight. Dante and Tomas planted themselves shoulder to shoulder between the charging pack and the 2 women retreating to cover. The lead Karkath lunged. Dante sidestepped at the last instant and drove his weapon butt into its flank hard enough to send it sprawling. Tomas's shot caught the second one square in the one unarmored seam of its underside. I'd reviewed 100 combat logs from 100 species facing this exact pack formation. Most died in the first exchange. These 5 fought like they'd studied the Karkath's weaknesses in advance, which was impossible, since the Karkath were a construct unique to this trial. The third, cornered and wounded, let out a shriek that should have sent any rational creature running. Ingrid laughed, a short, delighted bark. "Oh, I like this one," she called down. "It's got spirit." She dropped it a second later with a single clean shot, and looked, for just a moment, disappointed the fight had ended so fast. The trial's own combat algorithm logged the pack as neutralized in 4 minutes. My homeworld's combat evaluators, trained soldiers who'd spent their lives preparing for exactly this, averaged 11. Nadia walked over to the fallen Karkath and crouched beside it with something disturbingly close to fondness. Poor thing. All those teeth and it still couldn't land a hit. She glanced up. "Should we eat it?" "Absolutely we should eat it," Dante said. "Waste not. I want to be clear about something. In 11 cycles running this trial, I had never once heard a recruit joke about eating a creature that had just tried to kill them. Fear doesn't produce jokes. Fear produces silence, or screaming, or a frantic scramble for the extraction line. What I was watching didn't fit any pattern I understood. By the end of the first day they'd built a shelter from salvaged debris and Karkath bone, mapped the surrounding terrain, and were sitting around a fire sharing rations, laughing about the ambush like it had been a pleasant afternoon hike. I sat alone in the tower long after my shift ended, running the sensor logs over and over, hunting for the malfunction that would make this make sense. There was no malfunction. The instruments were fine. They were genuinely enjoying themselves. "You know," Marin said, leaning back against the shelter wall and staring up at the alien stars, "for a planet that wants us dead, it's actually kind of beautiful out here." Ingrid laughed. "Wait for tomorrow. I hear it gets worse the longer we survive." "Good," Dante said, tossing another piece of fuel on the fire. I was getting bored. I switched off my display and sat back, feeling something I hadn't felt in 11 cycles of this work. Not quite fear, not quite confusion. The uncomfortable sensation of watching a system I understood completely start behaving in a way I couldn't predict at all. Somewhere above the dome, in the true sky beyond the simulation, a council session was already being scheduled. I had no idea yet how right I was to be worried. 2. Escalation. Ambassador Ven of the Osvane Dominion was waiting for me in the observation chamber the next morning, and when a member of the Oversight Committee summons you before the trial day even begins, you don't make her wait. Evaluator Round, she said without looking up from the console. Explain these readings. I didn't need to ask which readings. I'd spent half the night trying to explain them to myself. Elevated positive effect markers throughout yesterday's engagement. Enjoyment indicators, alongside the expected stress response. I'm aware of what the data says, evaluator. I'm asking how it's possible. I hesitated, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. It's possible the trial parameters were miscalibrated for their physiology. Their threat response may simply be wired differently than we accounted for. Her crest flared, deep Osvane displeasure. The purpose of this trial is to determine whether a species can be trusted with frontline duty without becoming a liability under extreme stress. If a species enjoys extreme stress, what exactly are we measuring? A fair question. I didn't have a good answer. Escalate, she said. Tier 3. I want to see how they respond when this stops being pleasant. Tier 3 wasn't a setting I used lightly. It existed to permanently disqualify a species from combat consideration. A level so severe most recruits didn't survive contact with it. I'd used it 4 times in 11 cycles. Each time, extraction teams pulled broken recruits from the dome within the hour. Ambassador, Tier 3 carry significant risk of serious harm. If they're as capable as yesterday's footage suggests, that should present no undue risk. If they're not, we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of their capability. That is, after all, the point of this exercise. I didn't have the authority to argue with a council directive. At 0600 I pushed the gravity to 2.2 standard, thickened the atmosphere's toxin load past what their rebreathers were rated to filter indefinitely, and released a breeding pair of Drell burrowers, ambush predators that moved beneath solid rock and struck without warning. The humans woke to a world that had visibly turned against them. Tomas staggered as the new weight settled on his shoulders. Someone turned up the difficulty overnight. Toxins almost double yesterday's reading, Marin said, checking her wrist display. This place really doesn't want us here. I braced for the fear to finally arrive. Dante rolled his shoulders, testing the weight, and a slow grin spread across his face. Well, he said. Guess it hurt us complaining about being bored. Nadia actually laughed. I stared at the readings in disbelief as her vitals registered genuine amusement where I'd expected panic. The Drell struck 2 hours later exactly as designed, erupting from beneath the ground in a spray of dust, jaws already open. Ingrid was closest. Instead of freezing, she threw herself sideways with a speed that surprised even me, came up into a crouch, weapon already tracking the second lunge. Second one's behind Tomas. She shouted, and Tomas spun without hesitation, driving his weapon into the exposed flank as the creature broke the surface. The fight ran 6 minutes longer than the Karkath encounter and was considerably more dangerous. Marin took a glancing strike that tore through her suit and drew real blood, the kind that ends most trials on the spot for emergency extraction. She looked down at the wound, hissed through her teeth, and laughed. Okay, that one's leaving a mark, she said, pressing a field dressing to the cut. You good? Dante called, not slowing his own fight. I'm great. 10 out of 10, would get bitten again. I sat frozen at my console. Elevated pain response, exactly as expected. But underneath it, that same stubborn thread of enjoyment, as if some part of her found the whole ordeal thrilling. By the time both Drell were down, the squad had 2 serious injuries, a depleted medkit, and almost no ammunition left, by any reasonable measure, a costly, dangerous fight. And the conversation afterward wasn't shaken or traumatized. It sounded like athletes replaying a hard-won match. Did you see how that first one moved? Ingrid said, still catching her breath. No warning at all, straight up out of solid rock. I heard the ground shift half a second before it broke surface, Tomas said. Felt like a train coming. We should name them, Nadia said suddenly. The rock monsters. Feels wrong to fight something without knowing its name. Steve, Dante offered immediately. The first one's Steve. You can't name the thing that just bit Marin Steve. Steve's a great name for a monster, Marin said, still holding the dressing. Very unassuming. Lulls you into a false sense of security. I stopped the playback and sat in silence for a long time, watching 5 wounded, exhausted humans laugh together beside a fire on a planet actively trying to kill them. I filed my report that evening, careful to note every anomaly without editorializing. Ambassador Ven's reply arrived within minutes. 4 words. Escalate to Tier 4 immediately. Tier 4 had never been used on a living recruit. It existed only as a theoretical upper bound in the Engineering Corps' original specification, a level meant to be so overwhelming that no species, regardless of capability, could reasonably be expected to survive contact with it for more than a few minutes. I wrote back, Ambassador, Tier 4 has never been tested on a living recruit. Fatality risk is extremely high. Her answer came within seconds. That is precisely the point, Evaluator. We need to know what breaks them. Every species has a breaking point. Find theirs. I didn't sleep that night. Every model I ran returned the same grim probability. Statistically, someone was not walking out of that dome by morning. For the first time in 11 cycles, and against every rule I'd sworn to follow, I found myself quietly hoping the models would be wrong. 3. Terminal configuration. Tier 4 began at 0500, and within 30 seconds I understood why it had never been tested on anyone living. The gravity generators strained audibly, pushing the field to 3 times standard, enough to crush the skeletal structure of most Alliance species within minutes. The atmosphere thickened into a sickly green haze visible even through the tower's reinforced viewports. Lightning tore across the simulated sky with enough force to turn patches of ground to glass. And then there were the Scarrow. I need to explain what a Scarrow is, because until that morning I had only ever released them into empty calibration environments, never into a live trial with recruits present. A 9-legged apex predator construct the size of a transport vehicle, capable of crossing any terrain in total silence, its neurotoxin bite able to drop something 4 times its own mass in seconds. They hunt in coordinated pairs, communicating through subsonic vibration and chemical signal, which makes them nearly impossible to detect before they strike. I released 2 of them that morning with a sick, churning feeling in my chest I had never once felt in 11 cycles of this work. The humans woke to gravity that dropped 2 of them straight to their knees. That's not right, Tomas gasped, fighting to push himself upright. That's too much, too fast. Nadia was on the ground, one hand pressed to her chest, breathing in short, controlled bursts. Everyone, slow breathing. Don't fight the weight. Work with it. For the first time since the trial began, their vitals showed real strain, a spike in cortisol that finally matched the fear response I'd expected from day one. But not panic. Dante forced himself upright against the shelter wall, face pale, voice steady. Report. Sound off. Here. 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 Here, they answered, one by one. Okay, Dante said. This is bad. Genuinely bad. But we've handled bad before. We move slow. We conserve. We figure out what changed. Their rebreather filters were already failing under the new toxin load. Maybe 6 hours before saturation, Marin reported. Then we find cleaner air, or we extend filter life, Dante said. Marin, can you rig something? 20 minutes, and access to that crystal vein. The mineral structure might work as a filter medium, she said, already moving. This is the part of my report I have rewritten more times than any other, because I still struggle to convey what I watched over the following hours. Under conditions that should have caused total physiological collapse, crushing weight, poisoned air, collapsing ground, the humans did not stop functioning. They slowed. Every motion clearly cost them more than it should have. But they kept moving, kept solving problems, kept holding each other up, with no sign of the fear-driven breakdown I'd expected. The Scarrow found them 4 hours in. I've reviewed the sensor logs leading up to that moment more times than I can count, and I still can't pinpoint the instant they announced themselves, because Scarrow don't announce themselves. Ingrid simply went still mid-sentence and raised a closed fist. A silent signal I hadn't expected humans to share with half a dozen other Alliance species. Something's here, she whispered. I don't see it. I feel it. Ground's wrong. Wrong how? Dante murmured. Vibrations too smooth. Something's moving without touching the surface directly. I stared at my display in disbelief. The Scarrow's silent approach had been specifically engineered to defeat conventional detection. And this human, working from instinct alone, had sensed it coming before it struck. The first one erupted from beneath a rock 8 meters to their left, and even with Ingrid's warning, its speed nearly caught them cold, 9 legs blurring across broken ground, jaws parting around twin neurotoxin fangs that had ended every theoretical calibration run the engineering corps had ever conducted. What happened next is the footage I have watched more than any other in my career, because I genuinely didn't believe it the first time. Dante didn't run. He threw himself directly into the creature's charging path and drove his weapon into its foreleg joint with everything his crushed, gravity-strained body had left. The impact knocked the strike just wide enough that the fangs closed on air a hand's width from his shoulder instead of his throat. Now, he bellowed, and Tomas, already in position from their earlier coordination, fired straight into the exposed underside of its thorax, the single vulnerability listed in the Alliance's own combat database. Information the humans should never have had, and yet had somehow deduced from a half-second glimpse of anatomy. The Scarrow shrieked and staggered back. The second one struck from the opposite side exactly as pack doctrine dictated, timed for the moment their attention split. Nadia, still fighting the crushing gravity, threw herself into its path anyway, using a length of debris as an improvised barrier, buying Marin the half-second she needed to finish rigging her filter and pivot, releasing a burst of chemical irritant straight into the creature's sensory organs. It recoiled, blinded, and Ingrid's shot, fired with a precision that shouldn't have been possible under 3 times standard gravity, found the gap in its armor that blindness had opened. Both Scarrow retreated, wounded, into the storm-lashed dark. The 5 of them stood together, gasping, bleeding, shaking, having just survived the most dangerous encounter any recruit had faced at this tier. For a long moment, nobody spoke. I held my breath, waiting for the delayed reaction, the moment the accumulated horror finally caught up with them. Marin started laughing first, breathless, half hysterical, but genuine. We just fought off 2 of those things. Under this gravity. Pretty sure I broke a rib, Tomas said, still catching his breath. Worth it, Dante said, sinking onto a rock, his whole body shaking. That was, without question, the most intense thing that has ever happened to me. And I was once in a building collapse during an earthquake. You never told me about a building collapse, Nadia said. Wasn't relevant until now. Point is, this was worse. And somehow also more fun. More fun. Ingrid repeated, disbelief and something like giddy exhilaration mixing in her voice. Dante, its teeth missed you by centimeters. Aware, Dante said. Adrenaline's still going. Ask me again in an hour, I might have a different answer. Right now, though, I feel incredible. I stopped the footage there and sat in silence for a long time. Every model I'd run before authorizing this release had predicted a minimum 60% fatality rate for dual scaro contact under Tier 4 gravity. The humans hadn't just survived, they'd driven both creatures into retreat, sustained 0 fatalities, and were now trading jokes in the dark like they'd just come off a good match. 4. The Committee. The Oversight Committee's response was immediate, and this time it wasn't Ambassador Ven alone requesting my presence, but the full committee, 6 representatives from 6 member species, all of whom had apparently been watching the live feed in real time. "Evaluator Round," said the presiding representative, a Threxian elder named Domak, whose own species had, ironically, provided the genetic template for the very creature that had just failed to kill 5 humans. "Explain what we witnessed." "I don't fully understand it myself," I admitted. "Their tactical coordination exceeds what we'd expect from civilians facing an unfamiliar threat. Their physiological resilience under extreme gravitational and toxic stress exceeds our models. And their psychological response to mortal danger appears to be, for lack of a better word, positive." "Positive," Domak repeated slowly. "Evaluator, are you telling this committee that this species enjoys facing death?" "I'm telling this committee that the data suggests exactly that, and I don't yet know why. I believe we need to understand why before we decide anything further." The chamber went quiet. I could see the same unsettled confusion I'd been carrying for days reflected in half the faces around the table. We had built an entire evaluation system on the assumption that danger produces fear, and fear produces predictable, measurable behavior that tells us everything we need to know about a species. The humans had just proven that assumption wrong in a way none of us yet understood. "Continue the trial," Domak said finally. "But Evaluator, I want a full psychological and physiological workup on these 5 by the end of the next trial day. If this species genuinely does not fear death the way the rest of us do, that is either the most valuable asset the Alliance has ever discovered, or the most dangerous liability we've ever admitted into our military structure. We need to know which." Within 2 days, footage of the Scaro encounter had leaked well beyond the restricted Council archive. I started receiving communications from people I'd never previously interacted with, Alliance officers requesting technical clarification, researchers from 3 different species asking for access to the physiological data, and, most surprising of all, requests from human squads elsewhere in Alliance territory asking whether they could volunteer for future trial sessions. I want to stress how strange that was. In 11 cycles, I had never once received a volunteer request. Every other species treated assignment to the Death World trial as a grim, unavoidable obligation. Never something to seek out. The message that finally made the whole thing click came from a human liaison officer named Captain Idris Vance, submitting a formal petition on behalf of an entire infantry division for priority placement in the next trial cycle. Members of the 4th Terrestrial Division have expressed strong interest in this assignment following review of available footage, the petition read. Morale is notably, extremely high. Soldiers have specifically requested this posting be treated as a reward for exceptional service, rather than a standard obligation. A reward. I sat with that word for a long time, trying to understand how something designed to break the spirit of the most resilient species in the Alliance could be treated by an entire human division as a prize worth earning. Meanwhile, inside the dome, the squad's behavior only deepened the mystery. By the 5th day, Marin's improvised crystal filtration system had extended their rebreather capacity well past its rated specification. Field Engineering, our own technical division, later reviewed with open admiration. They'd built a semi-permanent camp near a sheltered rock formation and begun systematically mapping the dome's terrain and predator territories. "We should map the Scaro denning sites," Tomas suggested during one planning session I observed with growing fascination. "Know where to avoid unless we choose to engage." "Agreed," Dante said. "And track the storm patterns." Ingrid. "You notice the lightning concentrates around the higher ridgelines?" "Every time," Ingrid confirmed. "We stay low during peaks, we're basically fine." This wasn't the behavior of creatures being tormented by a hostile world. It was the behavior of explorers systematically mastering unfamiliar territory, treating every danger as a puzzle instead of a threat to endure. The Scarrow returned on the 7th day, a larger pack of 5, drawn by the scent of the wounded pair. By then the humans had countermeasures ready, a tripwire alarm rigged from debris and cord, sharpened stakes reinforcing their perimeter, and Ingrid's growing ear for the creature's hunting vocalizations, letting her predict an attack's direction with unsettling accuracy. The engagement ran 11 minutes, the longest sustained combat I had ever recorded in this trial's history, and ended with all 5 Scarrow killed or driven into permanent retreat, and all 5 humans functionally uninjured. 11 minutes, Nadia said afterward, checking her wrist timer. Not bad. Getting faster. Should be, Dante said. 4th time fighting this species. Getting a feel for the patterns. I still think we should try capturing one instead of just fighting it off, Marin said. Imagine studying that neurotoxin properly. You want to capture something that's tried to kill us 4 times, Tomas said, more amused than incredulous. I want to understand something that's tried to kill us 4 times. There's a difference. Isn't the whole point of being here to learn? I paused the recording there, struck by something in her framing I'd entirely failed to appreciate. The humans weren't just enduring the trial. They were treating it as an opportunity. A chance to learn, to test themselves, to gather understanding about a hostile environment with exactly the spirit of a curious child approaching a difficult new game. Our entire evaluation framework, I was beginning to understand, had been built on a fundamental misreading of how fear and danger relate to each other across species. We'd assumed all sapient minds process mortal threat the same way, that fear is a constant, and the only variable is how well a species suppresses it. Humans, it seemed, ran on an entirely different framework, one where danger and reward weren't opposites but were somehow woven together. The committee's completed psychological analysis, compiled with the help of a human specialist named Dr. Elena Marsh, confirmed what I'd begun to suspect firsthand. One passage has stayed with me since. Human psychology appears to have evolved under conditions of persistent, unavoidable environmental and social threat throughout the majority of the species' developmental history. Rather than an aversion response to danger, a significant portion of human neurological reward circuitry appears directly linked to the successful navigation of risk. This is not a malfunction. It is, per Dr. Marsh, a core evolutionary adaptation that allowed the species to persist and expand despite originating on a world that ranks, by any objective survey standard, among the most consistently hostile environments Alliance exploration teams have ever catalogued. I thought immediately of something Nadia had said, almost as a joke, on their first night in the dome. Comparing the trial's harsh conditions to something called altitude training, a practice humans apparently undertook voluntarily, subjecting themselves to reduced oxygen environments purely to improve performance, with no external requirement forcing them to. Dr. Marsh's report continued, human history contains extensive documentation of voluntary engagement with extreme danger for reasons ranging from scientific curiosity to simple recreation. Unassisted mountain ascents, exploration of unmapped cave systems, extreme athletic competition, pursued not by soldiers or specialists but by ordinary civilians, for the psychological satisfaction such activity provides. By human standards, this trial may in fact represent a relatively moderate example of the risk this species has historically sought out on its own. I set the report down and sat with it for a long time, trying to reconcile it with everything I'd believed, for my entire career, about the fundamental purpose of danger. V. Terminal configuration. The council reconvened on the 8th day, and the debate ran hotter than any session I'd witnessed. This changes the entire calculus of our evaluation system, Ambassador Venn argued, crest flaring. If a species processes mortal danger as rewarding rather than aversive, how can we trust their judgment in genuine combat? A soldier who enjoys danger may seek it out unnecessarily. May prioritize the thrill of a fight over the actual objective. Or, countered a Volition representative named Sarah, whose species had historically been among the Council's most cautious voices, a soldier who does not freeze, does not panic, does not hesitate in the moment of greatest crisis is precisely the soldier who saves an entire unit when a more cautious species would already have broken and fled. We have watched 5 examples of exactly that over the last 8 days. Are we going to discard direct observational evidence because it contradicts an assumption we've never actually tested? Evaluator Round, Domak said finally, turning to me. In your professional assessment, based on everything you've observed, do these humans represent a liability to Alliance operations, or an asset? I hesitated, aware that whatever I said next would carry weight far beyond 5 individual recruits. I believe, I said slowly, that we built this trial to identify species who could function despite fear. We never considered a species that could function because fear operates differently within their psychology to begin with. I don't yet know whether that makes them more reliable in the field, or less. But everything I've witnessed over these 8 days suggests capability that exceeds our expectations, not despite their unusual relationship with danger, but specifically because of it. Domak considered that for a long moment. Then we require further data, Evaluator. Prepare the final escalation. I want to see this species finally reach its limit. A familiar unease settled over me, because I understood exactly what that meant: terminal configuration. The trial's theoretical maximum. A setting that had never been authorized for use on any living recruit in the Alliance's entire evaluation history, an engineering specification never intended to actually be deployed. That night I sat in the tower, watching 5 people cheerfully catalog the dome's flora between combat engagements, with no idea what I would be releasing on them at dawn. And for the first time in 11 cycles, I found myself hoping, not because the Council demanded it, but because some part of me had come to genuinely respect the strange, fearless curiosity these 5 had brought to a trial designed specifically to destroy it, that they would prove capable of surviving what was coming. I entered the terminal configuration code at 0400, my hand hesitating over the console longer than I'd like to admit. Gravity would climb to 4 times standard, catastrophic strain even for the Alliance's most physically robust species. The atmosphere would turn directly poisonous rather than merely toxic, with zero margin for rebreather failure. And the environmental collapse protocol, a feature I had never once activated in 11 cycles, would begin a genuine structural breakdown of the dome itself, ground destabilization, terrain collapse, and the release of every remaining predator construct at once, rather than in the carefully managed waves I'd used all week. This wasn't a test of endurance anymore. It was, by design, an unsurvivable scenario, built specifically to establish a limit no species could reasonably be expected to exceed. The humans woke to a world that made every previous day look gentle. Ground's shaking. Tomas shouted over a constant, grinding rumble. This isn't storm activity, this is structural. Everyone up, now. Gravity hit them like a wall. All 5 staggered, several dropped to their knees under a weight their bodies, even after a week of adaptation, simply weren't built to withstand. This is bad, Nadia gasped, fighting for breath against both the crushing weight and the atmosphere now bleeding past the limits of her rebreather. This is really bad. Stay calm. Stay together, Dante called. For the first time in the entire trial, I saw something unmistakable in their vitals, real fear. Not the breakdown I'd expected on day 1, but a sharp, genuine spike of dread as their bodies correctly registered that this exceeded anything they'd faced before. Then the predators arrived, all of them, simultaneously. Every dangerous construct the dome had ever contained, released in a single overwhelming wave no evaluation trial had ever unleashed on a living recruit. Karkath packs larger than the first encounter. Drell burrowers erupting from ground that no longer offered stable footing. And Scarrow, a full pack this time, circling through poison dust, their silent approach made almost irrelevant by the chaos around them. My hand hovered over the emergency termination control. Every instinct I'd built over 11 cycles screamed that this had crossed from evaluation into something closer to execution, that no combination of skill or resilience could reasonably survive it. I hesitated, because some part of me, the part that had spent 8 days watching these 5 refuse to break, wanted to see what happened next. "We can't fight everything at once," Dante shouted, voice strained but steady. "We need defensible ground, now." "There." Ingrid pointed to a rock formation that, unlike the collapsing terrain around it, was still holding together. "High ground, one approach. Move." Injured, terrified, gasping in poisoned air under crushing gravity, the 5 of them forced their bodies forward, dragging each other when individual strength failed, moving as a single desperate unit toward the only defensible position in sight. They reached its seconds before the first Karkath pack closed the distance. What followed was, by every measure I have ever used to evaluate combat performance, the most desperate and remarkable fighting withdrawal of my career. Tomas took a Karkath claw across the thigh, a wound serious enough that I flagged it for emergency extraction consideration, and kept fighting anyway, using the formation's narrow approach to funnel attackers into a bottleneck, buying his people the seconds they needed. Burrowers incoming from below. Marin screamed, and Nadia, without hesitation, threw herself over the crack in the ground where Adrel's approach had been detected, using her own weight and a length of debris to jam its emergence just long enough for Ingrid to put a shot through the gap and end the threat. The Scarrow pack circled at the edges of the chaos, waiting, I understood with cold clarity, for the moment exhaustion and injury finally broke the humans' coordination. By every model my instruments had ever produced, that moment should have arrived within minutes. It didn't come. I watched, transfixed, as 5 badly injured, thoroughly exhausted humans kept fighting, kept protecting each other, kept making split-second tactical calls with a clarity that should have been impossible, for nearly 40 minutes. An engagement longer than every previous encounter combined. "Dante, we can't keep this up much longer," Marin shouted, voice raw, blood soaking through a dressing that had clearly failed. "We're out of ammo. Out of strength." "I know," Dante said, and for the first time I heard something genuinely uncertain in his voice, genuine fear. "I know. But we're still here. We're still fighting. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Nadia said, forcing herself upright despite obvious, severe strain. "We're not done yet." The Scarrow chose that moment to commit, all 5 converging at once, some cold predatory calculation telling them this was the moment the prey finally broke. What happened next has become something close to legend in the Alliance's evaluation community, discussed and reanalyzed far beyond the scope of my original report. Instead of breaking, instead of scattering the way any reasonable model would have predicted, the 5 humans, without a word of coordination I could find in the audio logs, moved into a tight defensive knot, backs against the rock, weapons raised, and simply refused to yield ground. Together, Dante said, his voice carrying a strange, fierce calm despite everything. "We hold together, or we don't hold at all." The Scarrow charge broke against a wall of coordinated resistance that should not have been possible from 5 people in their condition. And in the chaos of poison, collapsing terrain, and overwhelming numbers, something happened that no evaluation model had ever anticipated. They held. Not without cost. Every one of them took additional injuries in those final minutes. Ingrid took a Scarrow fang across the forearm, the neurotoxin dose thankfully weakened by the creature's earlier wounds. Dante cracked ribs on his uninjured side. But when the dust finally settled and the last Scarrow retreated, wounded and disoriented, into the collapsing terrain, 5 humans remained standing together, alive, having faced the single most severe scenario the Death World trial had ever been designed to produce. And having survived it. I sat in complete silence in the tower, watching 5 exhausted, badly injured people slowly lower their weapons, and felt something I had never once experienced in 11 cycles of this work. Not professional astonishment. Something closer to genuine, profound respect. "We're alive," Tomas said, disbelieving, sinking against the rock and cradling his leg. "I genuinely wasn't sure we would be." "Neither was I," Dante admitted, and for the first time I heard the full weight of what he'd endured surface in his voice, now that the danger had passed. "That was, without exaggeration, the hardest thing I've ever done." "Was it worth it?" Marin asked quietly, pressing a fresh dressing to her shoulder. A long pause. When Dante answered, his voice carried a quiet certainty I've thought about often since. "Yes," he said simply. "It was terrifying. I have never been more afraid in my life. And yes, it was absolutely worth it. Because we did it together, and we're still here." The dome's environmental systems began their scheduled shutdown moments later. Gravity eased. The poisoned atmosphere began to clear. The collapsing terrain, no longer actively destabilizing, settled into stillness. 6. What we were actually measuring. I submitted my final report that evening, not as a detached evaluator cataloging anomalous data, but as someone who had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary and wanted, more than anything, to make the people deciding what came next understand its full weight. The Deathworld adaptation trial was designed on the assumption that fear is a universal constant among sapient species, and that the purpose of extreme danger is to identify the threshold at which fear finally overwhelms function. Over 8 days, 5 human recruits have demonstrated conclusively that this assumption does not hold for their species. They experienced fear, genuine, severe fear, particularly during the final escalation. But that fear did not paralyze them. It did not fracture their coordination or their judgment. If anything, it sharpened their focus, deepened their commitment to one another, and produced tactical performance that exceeded every theoretical model this evaluation system has ever generated. I recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that the Alliance reconsider the fundamental design of this trial for human recruits specifically. This species does not need to be broken to reveal its true capability. That capability was on display from the first hour of the first day, and every escalation since has only confirmed what should have been obvious from the start. Humans do not require extreme danger to prove they can function under pressure. They appear to require it, for reasons our current understanding of psychology cannot fully explain, because facing it alongside people they trust is, apparently, one of the most meaningful experiences their species is capable of having. The Council's response, delivered 3 days later, formally revised the Deathworld trial protocol for all future human recruits, reducing the maximum escalation tier and introducing new evaluation criteria built specifically to account for humanity's unusual relationship with danger and reward. I visited the 5 of them once more before they shipped out to their next assignment, technically a violation of evaluator protocol, but one I felt, after everything, was entirely justified. I found them in a recovery ward, injuries healing, already laughing about some detail of the ordeal I'd apparently missed in my review of the footage. "Evaluator Round." Dante offered a respectful nod despite his still healing ribs. "Come to deliver our final scores?" "I came," I said, "because I wanted to understand something, and I think you're the only people who can explain it. Why does danger feel to your species like something worth seeking, instead of something worth avoiding at all costs?" Dante considered the question for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because we've always known the world could kill us, long before your alliance ever built a trial to prove it. Our history is full of ice ages, disasters, diseases that nearly wiped us out more than once. We never got a choice about facing danger. What we got to choose was how we felt about it. Somewhere along the way, our species decided fear wasn't going to be the only thing we felt when the world tried to kill us. We decided we could feel alive, too. Determined. Sometimes even joyful, when we came through it together. I didn't have an immediate answer for that, because it reshaped how I understood every piece of data I'd gathered over the previous 8 days. There's something else," Marin added. "This trial. All of it, the gravity, the poison, the monsters, the ground falling apart under us, it was hard. genuinely, deeply hard. But it was also one of the best experiences of my life, because I got to test myself against something real, alongside people I trust completely now. And we made it through. That combination, testing yourself, trusting your people, that's not something we're afraid of. That's something we chase. I left the recovery ward that evening with more questions than I'd arrived with, and a profound new respect for a species the Alliance had originally filed as fragile, unpredictable, and potentially unreliable under pressure. The Death World trial had been built, across every species that had ever faced it, to find the point where danger finally breaks someone. Humans had shown us something else entirely, a species for whom danger, faced honestly and faced together, didn't break anything at all. It built something instead. Something the rest of the Alliance was only beginning to understand, and something I suspected, watching 5 exhausted, laughing, deeply satisfied humans prepare to ship out, the galaxy had not yet seen the full measure of. Steve, the very first Scarrow they'd ever named, and the only one to survive every single encounter, became something of a legend among the human recruits who came after. Every new squad asked to meet him. And every squad, on learning he still patrolled his corner of the dome's simulated territory, expressed something dangerously close to genuine affection for the creature that had, on paper, been engineered to end their lives. I don't run the trial the way I once did. The protocols have been rewritten, the tiers rebalanced, the entire philosophy behind the evaluation reconsidered from the ground up. But I still think, often, about that final report. And about the quiet certainty in Dante Okafor's voice when he told me that facing the world's worst, together, was something his species had learned not to fear, but to embrace. We built a trial to find a species breaking point. We found out humans don't have one. They just have people worth holding the line for.